ourselves with the enlargement policy. And later, if there are any, if there is time for questions and answers and for discussion, maybe I can speak a little bit more about the initiatives which we're taking in this direction. We also need to work harder to create the awareness in the civil societies across the region that only if we combine pressure coming from the citizens and civil societies from the bottom up and the pressures coming from international organizations, the EU, so these top-down conditionalities and pressures, only that way we can really maintain and create proper pressure on the domestic political elites to continue with these sometimes painful reforms in the accession process. When I say painful, I think painful for the political elites because essentially leaders who don't cheat are maybe, a kind of utopia. They're not born, they're created, and we need to create them by maintaining or creating and boosting very active civil society which is very well connected to citizens, which really communicates to young people and to the citizens overall. And of course, it is, always worthwhile repeating that all of these reforms which we are speaking about, we need to be able to communicate them to everybody as something that we're doing for ourselves, for our children, for our brothers and sisters, and not just because we want to get to the European Union. The European Union is not an end in itself. It's an instrument for us to achieve better quality of life. Right now, just speaking about Serbia, 30% of young people have a negative reaction when the EU is mentioned. Almost half of them are neutral. These these 50% of the neutral young people who don't have either positive or negative reactions to the EU, they are our target group. We need to speak to them. We need to explain to them what the EU is really about. And that the fact that EU is also struggling with its values and reforms and democracies internally does not make it bad. It makes it a work in progress. And just like our societies and countries are a work in progress, so is the EU. But we need to be part of that in order to be part of that construction and part of that work in progress. And finally, it is worthwhile also mentioning that 56% of the young in Serbia believe that the reason why the country has not yet joined the EU is because it does not fulfill criteria related to democracy and the rule of law. This actually means that young people understand that democracy and rule of law are important. We just need to find a way to communicate this in a better way, and we need to find a better way. And I spoke about these ways, the way that we're approaching and that we see them. We need to find a better way to communicate these concerns of young people to the policymakers and to the decision makers, not only in our countries, but also in the EU and in the EU institutions. I will stop here. I think I've spoken somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. My stopwatch says 12, but maybe it has been 13. And I will be happy to discuss with you in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milena. I think we have you here until 5. Yes, I see a nodding. Okay, I think we'll be on time to have also a question round with you. Thank you very much for pointing out, I think, what is something really, really important, and that is the approach to data. And although I think in all of the countries from the region, the data would be similar, how important it is to have data and to kind of look into what and how young people foresee the future and what they think the main problems are. But also the second very important point, that the European Union is not something that will transform the countries and societies for us. It is something that is an instrument to help us to change and to become more in the sense European. But it's only a mechanism, and it's a question how strong we are as society and are willing to change in that direction, and to also build on transparency, but also on strengthening the rule of law in our countries. Thank you very much once again. And without further ado, we go to Mr. Misha Popovic. Misha, the Zoom link and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Blažen. Thanks for the invitation to speak. It's a very Big honor, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't attend. I mean, the plan was to come to Crucial and speak from there, but you know, the last week of September in the non-governmental sector is usually a tornado, so I had to stay. Uh, I would start by reading the title of today's session from the perspective of three types of people. An optimist would say that some leaders cheat. A pessimist would say some leaders don't cheat. And a realist would say all leaders cheat. So I think that by the end of my speech, I will try to convince you that the last thing is not true. Although it feels like Milena said, there are some leaders, I would say there, or that leaders don't cheat is an utopia. I would say leaders who don't cheat are a unicorn, but maybe they exist. We should see. Uh, I think that when we are talking about development and development of the Balkans, and from the perspective of good governance and fight against corruption, I think we should point out from the very beginning that it is not possible to imagine sustainable development, to imagine good governance, so institutions behaving in the public's interest before we have rule of law. So what does this mean? It means that whenever something happens which is outside of the law, there is a high probability that a process will be initiated and the responsibility will be measured according to the rules. And ideally, rules are applicable to everyone. In our countries, the independence of judiciary, or more accurately, the dependence of judiciary, does not permit that. So this is where corruption thrives. If leaders or any kind of official or business person uh, initiate a corrupt process, it's not likely that it will end in a sentence. So this impedes development because without rules there are no enforceable institutions, because institutions are rules. Institutions are not buildings. And without the judiciary, without a due process, we cannot expect development. Why is this? So when we are talking about corruption in the Western Balkans, uh, we talk about power networks. These power networks consist of powerful individuals on local and national level. So when you're saying the president is corrupt, it's not only, it is not an absolute position of corruption, and the others are simple subordinates to this person, but it is a network, and this network, and in this network, every person, every node in the network has some level of resources, some level of power, and by that, a leverage to evade rules. So when someone starts, so for instance, when someone starts, uh, some public prosecutor starts a process against, let's say, a mayor, the mayor can most probably defend himself because he has enough resources to evade justice. These power networks resemble more the feudal network of power. And because you have young people in the audience, when you learn from history, This kind of the king was not was at the top of the pyramid, but he was not an absolute monarch. There was significant amount of power in the other vassals, the dukes, the counts, and so on. What happened in terms of rule of law and institutional development, and if you take, for instance, the best practices in Europe, and those are the Scandinavian countries, they used, when the absolute monarchs came to power, they faced backlash from the other point of power in the feudal system. And they needed, they used the army, they used the power to appoint independent judges, to appoint independent administration, to enforce rules in order to be at the top. So basically, the interest of the monarch was a rule of law interest. And that's how they had, for instance, Sweden, Denmark, they had a good starting point because of this. We don't have this. And in times of democracy and with every kind of reservation, taking that some of our democracies in the Western Balkans are challenged, are put into question, the democratic process still exists. People go on elections and win elections, and they can win elections by fraud, but they win anyway. So in times of democracy, however you want to define it, appointing judges is not possible in the Scandinavian model from the 1800s and 1700s. You have to have a process in the parliament, a process in other means and branches of power in order to put the right people at the right places and start enforcing rules. And this is difficult in corrupt democracies. So the institutions cannot enforce rule of law on their own because they are inside there are these power networks of corruption. So how to do it? Milena said, civil society's initiatives are very important in ensuring democratic development. She said, democracy is found on the streets. So the only way to put people in power who are reformists, the only way to put institutions, to put pressure on institutions is by the so-called collective action, is by civic initiatives, civic engagement, civic activism, and constant pressure by NGOs, citizens, journalists, which kind of makes increases the cost of corruption. This is the point, to increase the cost of corruption and increase the cost of not following or not enforcing rules. But we have a problem in the Western Balkans, and that is that there is a increasingly decreasing human capital in the Western Balkans. Young people are moving out. Milena quoted some statistics from Serbia. As Blažan said, they are very similar throughout the Western Balkans. Young people feel alienated from society and they are not the optimists in society, and they frequently try to find way out and not participate in the state building because there are no cathartic events in state building recently. There haven't been. Maybe in Montenegro last year, but it's not a big cathartic event. So there are no state building events which hold people here and offer some space for enthusiasm, which can keep people here and make them participate in societies, in societal processes. So this is a dilemma, or how to make young people stay. And while creating opportunities for civic activism is not a deliberate process, activities from NGOs can be a deliberate process and can be very organized process. So through civil society, but through non-governmental organizations, we can help grassroots stay here and develop. And also working with media, we can also provide more opportunities for investigative journalism, for journalistic proficiency in reporting on rule of law infringements, on corruption, and thus creating some sort of pressure which can create cathartic events. And once we have a cathartic event, we can go back to, let's say, 1991, 1992, where people stayed and tried to build societies, at least some people stayed. So there is a necessity of this tipping point where we can basically stop people moving away, because I don't see how the numbers of development tell us that people will stay because of economic development and education and business opportunities. They simply are not here, and we are trying to create the possibility for political pressure in the lack of economic opportunities in the Western Balkans. So that's in short my presentation.
Thank you very much, Misha. Thank you very much for the excellent points about especially being positive and thinking that we can achieve change. But as also Milena said, the youth in general has kind of become more pessimistic and a more how should I put this lightly, more skeptical about the future in the countries, and that we can achieve anything in the region and in our countries. But I think as a true optimist, I always say it's our job to leave a better mark for the next generations and try to build up the bridges that we're talking about, and put down the barriers that were put in front of us by the generations before us. And I think this is a good talking point to start with Adi. Please, Adi, the Zoom link and the participants, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for inviting me and for being here, dedicating your time to listen to us discussing about this. Let me start by telling you a short story that happened to me around 3 or 4 weeks ago. An advisor of a very important politician, foreign politician working in the Western Balkans, asked me if I personally was tired of reconciliation, history, and talking about the past in the Western Balkans, and whether, in fact, a politician or a foreigner coming to the Western Balkans should at all discuss about reconciliation and past, or should he or she rather focus themselves on the future. And we had a short exchange and short debate about it. I said it was important. I tried to convince why it was important, why I thought it was important. And we left with him telling me that I should provide him three talking points, let's put it like that, on past and on the reconciliation that could be useful for this politician. So let me start with, and my presentation is slightly based on what I've then as a follow-up sent to this person. Let me start with a short quote from a Canadian historian, Margaret Macmillan, who once wrote, "Examining the past honestly, whether that is painful for some people or not, is the only way for societies to become mature and to build bridges to others." The big title of this panel today is Barriers into Bridges, Securing the European Future of the Region. So if we're gonna follow Margaret Macmillan, if we want to talk about barriers or building bridges, we need to then examine the past honestly. But the fact is, examining the past honestly, be it in politics, be it in history, be it in a circle of your friends over a cup of coffee or a glass of beer, is really, really difficult, because talking about history is often very emotional and is often based on the things that we're taught in schools or things that we read in newspapers or watch on the TV. And there, in history textbooks, on TV, newspapers, we are mostly told stories that, for the purpose of this presentation, I want to describe as a nationalistic approach to discussing and talking about history. And that is the one that awakes emotions of loyalty. The point of teaching or talking about the history for nationalists is to instill patriotism and to convey that in a dangerous world, the survival of any nation depends on its ability to win its battles. So the battles, historical battles, become very important in these examinations. These are the stories we hear also in the region, but elsewhere as well, of a nation surrounded by enemies, where we have national heroes and the others, foreigners, have only villains, where we have periods of suffering and victimhood alternating with militarily triumph. So sometimes, ironically, we're at the same times heroes and at the same times victims. And we keep repeating these stories. And telling this kind of stories about our history is actually a worldview that is at odds with the multi-ethnic nature of all of our 6 Western Balkans states. Because nationalistic approach to the history and to telling the stories about history without honestly examining the past is the one that does not accept the view that in a democracy, a historian's role is to challenge cherished myths. And that in a, how do I say it? And that in open society, history should kind of prepare students for citizenship in a world where all institutions are imperfect. So we just spoke about the European perspective. We've spoke about the reforms. If we accept that our institutions are imperfect today in the Western Balkans, if we accept that they are not at the level that the EU's are, that a lot of reforms are needed to achieve the standards that the EU has, how come that we are not ready to accept that possibly the way we have been discussing or looking at our histories is not done in a similar way, that we don't look at our history as a potentially also having imperfect aspects. I think that's important point for anyone who has a nationalistic approach to the history, going into another more useful and more helpful, not just for looking at history, but also for the future point, is where you say, okay, there are some historical figures, there are some historical battles that we had, some moments in history that maybe we were taught to admire, but maybe in those in those events or in those aspects, there was something that was also not fully respectable. Maybe maybe even those that we admire and that we are taught to look at as heroes, maybe they were responsible for crimes. So if we want to talk about barriers or building bridges, we need to be ready to say that we need to look at our own history in a more detailed way and be ready to discover that some of the people, some of the battles that we were taught to admire maybe have something bad in them that we need to put on a disclose and that we need to discuss. I think that in that sense, that's also important for the European perspective of the region, because that's how you build a society that is mature, that is open, and that is capable to move beyond the narratives that turn us into the circle all the time. Now, what is important to understand is that this battle between, I would say, for this purpose of this presentation, between the nationalist approach to history and the open view of history is not unique for the Balkans. If you go to France, if you go to Paris, and if you ask people about Napoleon, you will learn from most of them very little or very few about the things that are linked to him that could, from today's perspective, potentially be seen as crimes, as something that is horrible, and that's something that should not be seen as something acceptable at today. If you look at the discussions on history textbooks in Russia, in Japan, or even in the UK, when it comes to the bombing of German cities during the Second World War, you will see a lot of emotions. You will see a lot of battle between those who want their society to look at history from an open view and to see and to look also for the potential flaws that we can then learn from and that can then make us as a society much stronger. The second point I want to share with you today is that if we talk about reconciliation and European perspective, then a major part of its understanding is the understanding that the wars and military do not solve any political, economic, or social problems. Here I have to say, I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I must say, as I was going through the school after the war, I was 10 years old. I've missed the point of being taught that military and weapons do not solve anything. And I think for my generation, maybe that's also obvious because we grew up in immediately after the war. But I think for the generations today that are going through schools, that point is not necessarily clear. I think that any young person in the Western Balkans should, around age 14, be clear that no matter how difficult political situation in our region is, no matter how much you might feel Europe is unfair, neighbors are unfair, the world is unfair, no matter how difficult the economic situation might be and lack of perspective, none of that will be solved by taking arms and by sending military on anyone. It will quite the opposite, make all those issues more complex, more difficult, and it will push the Western Balkans and your own country or your own nation even further to the periphery of Europe. And when I saw the images from the Kosovo-Serbia borders from the past 2 weeks, seeing on both sides police and military vehicles being sent and used in political dispute over car plates, I got worried, because even if one side declares a victory and the other side says, oh, we lost this one, or both sides declare victories, I fear that the images of these weapons and police and military will once again, 20 years after, potentially push us on a path where using police military force is legitimate in order to win political points or political gains. On the side, all the arguments in favor or against car plates, in favor of one solution or the other. I'm just speaking here about the image of military and policemen with guns. And the last point from me is if we talk about reconciliation, that then we also need to talk about whether our states and governments are working actively on reconciliation. I can tell you 5 to 10 years ago, 99.99% of work on reconciliation and on how do we look at the history and then the facts from the past was done by non-governmental organizations who were mostly financed by foreign donors. And while that is an immensely important thing, it is extremely important that we have that. We will be able to speak about long-standing sustainable reconciliation in our region only when our governments use the instruments of, let's say, curricula in schools or support for the civil society organizations to do the things that are required for us to speak about reconciliation and the past. And when they don't meddle into how they do it, but allow them to do it on a best European and the world experience in doing that, we will be able to say that we are on a sustainable path towards the reconciliation in this region. And I must say, next to the Regional Youth Cooperation Office, I can't remember many of the instruments that the Western Balkan states or governments have deployed or have invested in that are doing that. So in that sense, RYCO is definitely a step in right direction, but we need to, trickle that down to the level of classes, history classes in schools, to our public TV stations, to our politicians who we look at and who we listen to, understanding that their words and their actions are important to how we develop our society and how we see ourselves. So to cut it shortly, to this politician or to this advisor to this politician, I said, if you want, you need to talk about how we teach history and how we speak about history. We need to win the battle that looking at the history in an open way, where we are ready to be disappointed by some of our heroes, is a right way. We also need to make sure that across the region, young generations are brought up with thinking that military and weapons can never solve any of the economic, political, or any other problems that we have, but they will make it even worse. And we need to make sure that our governments take over as much as possible as their own agenda, reconciliation and support for civil society organizations that do wonderful and great things, and that governments do that without meddling into how exactly they're doing that. Thank you. I'm happy for any questions that might come.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Adi, for the beautiful insights about reconciliation. Coming from Skopje, the town that completely rebuilt its city center in order to go further back into history and to find out where we come from, and trying to build an identity of somehow. It clearly resonates what you're talking about and how politicians misuse the interpretation of history in order to be even more powerful in the present. But I think we have to be clear that we elect politicians to look into the future, into the present, not interpret the history for us. And I think this is something very, very important that you really brought closer to us. At this moment, we have around 40 minutes for questions until 5, and then we will have Mariola, who will join us. She will give us a speech, and then we'll have again questions. But I would like to now open up the floor to everybody in the room. I don't know if the speakers can see you as clearly as I can see you. Maybe I'll start the video and show it to them that you're all here and very much interested in what they were talking about. So please feel free to ask for the microphone. If you have any questions to anybody of our speakers, or any comments or any ideas that came up during the speech, please feel free to raise a hand. Don't be shy. I was told that in the previous session you were shy and then you opened up. Here we have one question.
Okay, thank you very much for the for what you said. I was very interested in what Mr. Adnan Cherimagic said about history. I need to say that I think, okay, first of all, I think that we try to remember history, and then we always, not always, but sometimes we make the same mistakes again, even if we keep trying to remember not to do them. But like, I wanted to say that I went to Skopje in this square that you were mentioning, and I started looking at the statue and was like, ah, okay. And there were no women, for example. And so my thought now is like, yes, history, amazing, we have to, I don't know, refer to it, but also we have to understand that there were no black people, there were no LGBTQI, blah, blah, blah people, women, people of color, etc., etc. So I think that we should have a more comprehensive vision of history when we speak about that. So maybe we will never do that, because I think history has been written by men, mostly white and Western, so maybe not even Eastern. So yeah, so it's a huge work that we have to do. Yeah.
Turned on. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for your comments. Are there any other comments or possible
Yes.
questions? Yes? Oh, back there.
Here.
I cannot see you from the light, sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. So my name is Nino, and I found really interesting the words from Ms. Milena Lazarevic regarding the policy reforms that they were making in Serbia. My question is, like, what was the most challenging, like maybe 3 cases when you were working in this reforming the policies? Because when we are talking about preventing the corruption, there are a lot of levels. Like we are talking about the mentality of the people. Like we are starting from individual level. We can also here tackle public administration, public procurement. There are a lot of levels of corruption. So I really wonder, like, what were like the biggest challenges for you when you're working in Serbia, tackling this corruption prevention and policy reforms?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nino. Maybe I would also give this question later on to Misha, because it is an interesting one. How do you tackle corruption with policies as well in North Macedonia, and what his experience is? But please, Milena, first the floor is yours.
The think tank, we're not actually working on policy reforms directly. What we are doing is monitoring of reforms in the area of public administration, and we are actually doing that regionally, so across the region. The same kind of monitoring exercise is being implemented in each of the 6 countries in the region, but using the same methodology, which allows us to come to regionally comparable results. I will send the links to these reports to the organizers, so maybe they will be able to forward them to anybody who is interested in checking them out. So basically, in that way, we don't directly contribute to the reforms, but we know from our experience for the previous 4 years that indirectly we do. And by monitoring various areas, so we monitor across the whole range of public administration reform segments or elements. In the EU's approach, the so-called principles of public administration, there are 6 areas of the public in the whole public administration reform sector. So we monitor across the board. And for example, in the area of public finance management, we have an indicator which focuses on budget transparency. We have an indicator which focuses on public procurement. Then, for example, in the area of accountability, we have an indicator which focuses on proactive and two indicators, one focusing on proactive and one on reactive transparency of the administrations, of the governments. In the area of policy making and policy development and coordination, we are monitoring public participation and consultation processes in policy making, inclusiveness of policy making, etc., etc. We also monitor regularity of reporting on various strategies, government plans, etc. And basically, what this research allows and this kind of monitoring allows us to do is to benchmark countries against each other, the administrations against each other. In the previous monitoring cycle, for example, it proved to be quite effective when we showed that on some indicators, for example, Kosovo was faring better than Serbia. This made many people in the administration in Serbia quite angry, but at the same time, I think it also stimulated them to look a bit more closely at our findings, and also at the findings of some other international indicators, which similarly found that on some indicators Kosovo was doing better than Serbia. But for example, when I was referring to how some of the countries that are not so far along in the EU accession process used to be better in the previous monitoring cycle, and now they have regressed. For example, Kosovo is unfortunately one of those examples where they have, in the meantime, in the past 2 to 3 years, they have abandoned some of the good practices which they built in the previous period. So this is something that we are also observing and that we are trying to show here, that many of the good practices which are being built in these reforms, they're not getting sufficiently institutionalized and embedded. And already now in the EU accession process, in this pre-accession period, we are witnessing regressing and backsliding on many reforms, on many areas of reforms, which we were kind of hoping would not happen at least until the point of EU accession. We are kind of, approaching this whole project saying, okay, once the EU hard conditionality is gone, and once, Sigma, OECD, and these other international actors are no longer there to monitor and to pressure for reforms, we should be there to do that work, the civil society. And this is why we're now building our capacities and learning how to do this kind of evidence-based monitoring of reforms, benchmarking, etc., which is, a very complex analytical and research exercise. But we're actually already witnessing backsliding now in the pre-accession process, which is what really differentiates us from the Central and Eastern European countries, in which that kind of backsliding only happened post-accession. So we are actually witnessing how ineffective already EU's conditionality is. And this is why we are now working much more to involve the citizens and to try to gather citizens' experiences through an online platform across the region. We're doing this also with local organizations to whom we have given out small grants to implement small projects around the region. So there are 30 organizations around the region doing these smaller projects. And they're helping us also involve citizens and gather citizens' inputs on their experiences with public administrations, with the institutions, with their openness, transparency, accountability, and all of those issues that actually citizens care about that on a daily basis. And we are trying to now speak more with the voice of the citizens. So not just with analysis, not just with research, but with direct stories and inputs from citizens, because we're trying to amplify the voice of these, of the evidence and of the research, because it seems that, sometimes not even that is enough to persuade our governments that they have to do something about these problems. So we're kind of, trying to, again, experimenting with entering somehow with these personal stories and personal anecdotes and personal experiences of citizens, and trying to amplify these voices. It is all, always a work in progress, and searching for new ways to persuade unwilling governments in the region to actually, do what the citizens want them to do, and what citizens obviously are not given enough opportunity to express. Because if you remember the data that I spoke about, if almost 2/3 of young people in Serbia actually care about anti-corruption policies, if they believe that the reason why we're not entering the EU is not Kosovo, or not some I don't know, in the past it used to be the Hague Tribunal, now it's Kosovo, for many people. But for the young people, it's actually rule of law reforms and democracy. They actually understand and believe that this is what is holding us from joining the European Union. So if young people already see that, then the fact that the governments are not reacting and delivering those reforms is showing a very deep flaw in our democracies. And this is why we're kind of somehow trying to, add this participatory element of the democracy to the biggest extent possible, and to speak not only with the voice of civil society, with the voice of evidence, with the voice of the research and analysis, but also to amplify it with these citizen experiences directly. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, the fact is that we're not directly working on these reforms as civil society organizations. We are monitoring them and then exerting pressure on the governments through various means to implement the reforms.
Yeah, if I can join, I would
Yeah,
like to
I,
talk
I was
about.
coming to you, Misha. Now, I
Yeah.
just wanted to emphasize maybe something in terms of you previously in the start of your speech you said power structures are the one that are corrupt and are grabbing the power somehow. But how do we deconstruct these power structures? What are the elements to it except civic participation, of course, and what Milena said, that the citizens should raise their voice, and giving people the voice and saying that this is important. How do we deconstruct these power structures?
Uh, Thank you for the very hard question. But first, it's about, I wanted to talk a little bit about mentality. I often hear about this. There is a mentality for corruption. There is no innate mentality for corruption in any country, in any nation, in any ethnic group. People have adapted to the rules of the game. You call that mentality, but it's not a cultural trait. It's an adaptation, it's a life strategy of people, because when they're ill, when they go to the doctors and when they are asked for a bribe, they won't think about rule of law. They will think about how to get um, the health service they are entitled to. And this is what we have to remember. It's not a cultural thing. I mean, uh, uh, people here have been living in societies which at some point in their time have been better governed, at least with a little more integrity than today. So when we are thinking about how to devise reforms, it's about, and if you want to approach a bit about some values which underpin corrupt behavior, we should not treat it as innate mentality of people, but as adaptation to how society here works. This is first. The second is how do you tackle corruption with policy? And I will here try to answer what Blažen asked me to, how to deconstruct these power networks. These power networks depend on some economic development. So for instance, we know from historical developments, when the middle class increases in size, when the cost of clientelism increases, then the leverage, the resources of the brokers decreases. And we are not there yet with the economic development. So that's why I said we should think about political ways, political paths, how to deconstruct these power networks. First is support to reformists. As I said, not all leaders are corrupt. Some are not. Some are somewhere in between, ambivalent to the rule of law and corruption. but reformists need support because when they enter politics, they are faced with their peers, sometimes from their own political parties or ruling coalition, where they must fight against more powerful politicians who don't have the public interest in mind. So this is one way how the democracy, how the demos or the people who are active citizens can support reformists who can also start implementing policies. This is one way how you, as civil society, enter into influencing policy. Of course, what Milena is doing with monitoring is also one way of influencing policy. But once the people who monitor, set the standards, set evaluations and assessments, then other types of civil society organizations enter and say, yes, we can help you, a reformist politician, employ some policies. And it's a debate of a slow progress. Because the changes are at this point in time in most of the Western Balkans countries dependent on the people managing certain specific institutions. Once they are out, reforms start decreasing, sometimes going in the wrong direction. So it's an incremental game of winning. But when you go and when you have an opportunity to influence policy, the first thing is that you start by improving the capacity of the institution, especially first scanning it, so to see where the institution is vulnerable, then start building human capital into that institution, because the ultimate point of the game is for the institution to be resistant to changes in management. And this is by investing in capital. But then civil society usually tries to help these people there stay in that institution. Unfortunately, we have a very bad example in North Macedonia of an institution that had large investment in anti-corruption, that is the special public prosecutor, which ended up being dismantled because of interest of politics, but because of its internal lack of integrity, especially the leader of that kind of institution. But for instance, similar types of successes in other countries have been dependent on building internal forces in institutions which can resist corruption pressures. And now, as I said in my in the first part, it's important that civil society focuses on the judiciary. So the point is primarily now by collective action, by putting constant pressure. So one type of organizations monitors, puts pressure, mobilizes citizens to react. Other types of organizations help devise strategies, devise approaches on how these institutions should be developed, and push for better judiciary, push for better public prosecutor, push for better judges. And from there, this is a very difficult thing to do, but from there, the job gets very, very easier because it's easier for civil society, for journalists to create court cases. It's hard to bring them to close. That's why the push for independent judiciary is paramount now in all countries of the Western Balkans if we want some success in fighting corruption.
Thank you very much. Do we have other questions, comments, ideas that maybe have been brought up to you that you want to speak out? If not, I have plenty of questions myself. Maybe I would go to Adi and that with something that, and I will quote Misha here from I think 1 month ago when we were talking on a different occasion. It's going back to what you were saying and how we interpret history and how we see ourselves in the Western Balkans and how we concentrate only on ourselves. I think Misha a month ago, and I'm paraphrasing here right now, said like, 200 years ago, 150 years ago, there were no borders basically here in the region. People could move freely, could sell their merchandise anywhere basically in the region and work together. How do you think this changed in the modern in the modern times where countries all of a sudden changed into a more nationalistic approach towards the region, but themselves as well? If you would ask somebody 200 years ago if they're Macedonian, Albanian, or whatever, they would probably say, "I'm a merchant," or whatever, not their identity. How did this come along? Was it the wars? Was it the military force? Was it the politicians themselves that changed somehow our societies? Or what do you think?
Thank you. Well, I'm not a historian myself. I have to explain also that maybe because I might have given a wrong impression from my introductory remark. We at ESI, we became interested in the history and reconciliation in the Western Balkans because we come to realize that that is the aspect that is of the interest for EU and international, let's say, politics or international organizations working with or on the region. And we found it to be an important part of the stability. What I tried to explain, of course, was that if we live today in a societies that, as Milena and Misha were trying to also explaining about institutions, corruption, policies, monitoring, etc. If we are capable of looking at our current institutions and current political system from a perspective of, monitoring, being critical, suggesting, etc. We also, for a future stability of our region, we also need to look at the history with a similar way of scrutiny and similar readiness to discuss about negative aspects. When it comes to your question, again, I'm not a historian, but I would say that it's related to the stories we tell. And I think that's also a part of a danger for the current situation in the Western Balkans. The stories really matter. It really matters what the majority of people are convinced about. If they're convinced that the borders, that the military, that invasion of the other, that protecting it, that portraying your own history or nation as being heroic and always great while others are villains and wrong, I think it's related to the fact that by telling those stories, either elites or those that are able to tell the story believe that that's going to be beneficial for their group or for the people they are in. So I think that it's probably related to the stories being told and to the sense of what matters and what can improve the everyday life. And if I can jump to today, and why I think the stories we tell today matter is because the story about European perspective is no longer a story that majority of people believe in our region. The story of there is a process, we can take part in it, we will become members of the EU, we will tear down the borders, we will open trade, we will integrate with the EU, and we will be happier, we will be richer, we will be doing better, and we will be to some extent also accepted or part of this European family is no longer the dominant story. There is a battle of fierce narratives about Europe having its own problems today, not being better than us or even being worse than us. There is a battle within the EU itself between Hungary, Poland, the stories being told there and the stories and other stories. And I think for the Western Balkans, with the institutions that Milena and Misha really described very well, with everything that we know about the Western Balkans today, I think that this confusion or lack of a credible story being told leaves an open space for different kind of stories to be told. And in that sense, also this military aspect that I've discussed with you, or weapons aspect from the past couple of weeks, is I think part of that. It's part of the story of European Union weakening, and then some resorting to the old stories that they think that can quickly replace this other story. So I think, and I will stop there just to allow also others. I think what is a challenge for our generation, for people like Misha, Milena, and me, and you, and people sitting in your room, is really to discover in today's world what is the story that we want to tell about ourselves, about our region, about the world, and how do we, with that story, win the majority and make sure that we are living a better life and we're living in a more prosperous society than it is today.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We have two questions, or one question. One question? Two questions. Okay, maybe we'll go with both, because I think Milena has to leave in 10 minutes, so we'll grab the two questions together. Please.
Okay, so you can hear me from what I see. And hello to our guests, and congratulations for your speeches. From what we can understand by the three of them, it is an open question. We can say that there is a puzzle of elements between the power structures, corruption, the educational tools that the youth could use in order to look beyond those structures. And I wanted to ask, is this an opportunity for an open call for the academia to be energetically involved in the civil society sector for social and political issues that may be too fresh, or fresh wounds, or a little bit sensitive for the civil society sector to be carried out by only this factor. So could this be an open call for academics and more research analysis and purposes to be engaged in the civil society, so as to provide an academic background on how can we perceive and re-examine those structures, and also how can we battle corruption? So yeah, this is my open question, and thank you.
Thank you very much. We have the second question here, right next to Egli. Please.
Hi from me again. Opa. My question is for Adi. So in history, as I know, one generation is, I know that you're not historian, wait for it, I will come at it. In one generation is considered to be for 25 years, and for now, I mean, the reconciliation process in the Western Balkan countries has been going on for 30, 20 years somewhere. So we can all agree that one generation has passed from then. Can you maybe compare the response on the reconciliation activities and process from, I don't know, some older generations and the young people now to this process? What is the response from the young people now? And what is the response of the, not older, but older generation in response to the reconciliation process? Thank you. Maybe put a comparison between two of them.
Thank you very much, Nicola. You can call them boomers, the older generation. And we have a last minute third question, please.
Okay. I just wanted to ask Ms. Milena, why do we have to separate the rule of law and fighting corruption? Wouldn't they go together as a fact? Okay.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the questions. Maybe we go off with the first, and about how civil society can include or should include academics and the analysis, maybe Milena can start. And also with the third question that we had, please.
Okay, thank you. Including the academia, it is an ongoing challenge for us in the civil society. We have actually worked with academic institutions. For example, in Serbia, we're often collaborating with an institute related to or linked to the economics faculty of the Belgrade University. We are now implementing a project together with the Faculty of Political Science, but it's not always easy. And, I think that the way that the research community, the academic research community is organized in our countries has a bit to do with that, because it's usually not the universities who do the research, but these, at least in some countries of the region. I know that this is not the case, for example, in Albania, it's different, but in most ex-Yugoslav countries, you have these old institutes, public institutes, which then have their own sources of funding, and then us from the civil society, usually we cannot access those sources of funding. So somehow, because we are not applying for the same open calls and calls for proposals, maybe this is why we're not collaborating more. But we do have examples of working with the academia, and I do agree that we need to, let's say, be even more theoretically and academically embedded in what we do. We are, for example, right now implementing one big regional project. Actually, it includes also countries from the previous enlargement, like Romania and Bulgaria, which is actually being supported by some European academic institutions in research, specifically on anti-corruption and fighting grand corruption, political corruption in the region. So yeah, we do have examples of that, but I agree that this is not always easy, and we need more of that definitely. And there should be, let's say, more incentives for creating these kinds of links and collaborations, which also should be recognized in the various schemes for funding. And unfortunately, at least in Serbia, for example, the social science research schemes that the government is offering are not open to private think tanks. They're just open to these public institutes that are basically governmental. So there we have a bit of a problem with when it comes to funding that kind of collaboration. For the last question on why we need to separate rule of law and anti-corruption, I'm not sure when I said that. I don't think that I have, and if I have, I apologize. I wasn't aware that I communicated that. Maybe I was just enumerating something, so I mentioned rule of law and anti-corruption, meaning including anti-corruption. Definitely anti-corruption policies are part of the rule of law, but also part of the public administration reform agendas, which are very closely interlinked, especially in the EU accession process. So I had no intention to separate them from each other.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you very much. Misha, would you like to add something? I see your poster, No to Corruption.
I'm going to say goodbye now. I'm sorry for interrupting. Thank you very much for offering me this opportunity, and I wish you a great end of this event.
Thank you very much, Milena.
All the best, Milena.
Yeah, thank you, Blažan. I said that they are separate, rule of law and corruption, simply because you cannot fight corruption before you have rule of law. So before you have a relatively functioning judiciary, because when you find, for instance, when a journalist finds a case of corruption and brings it to the public, if there is no independent public prosecutor who can start the case in front of a judge, and the judge independently to try and see if the person is guilty or not, then you have impunity. That being corrupt is highly is not costly, because it doesn't cost you your freedom, because you won't be fined to be guilty. So you cannot fight corruption before you have relatively capable and independent judiciary. In no country, the very, very highly resourceful people end up being tried. We had the financial crisis in the US, didn't result with many people going to jail. But you have a better functioning judiciary. So you have many people in the American politics going to jail for election fraud, for instance. So here in the Western Balkans, the judiciary is not there yet. It's not independent. That's why you need to separate things in order to understand why there is no success in fighting corruption. That's what I wanted to say by separating these two. And to answer the question about the academia, yes, I mean, academia has to first play their own part, and that is substantially modernize and improve their research, especially the social science departments, because they have the opportunity and the timelines, because civil society functions in a much more narrower timelines in order to research, argument, and deliver recommendations. So we usually operate in a year-to-year basis. Big research projects carried out in academia, they are multi-year projects, and doing academic work takes time. So first, the involvement of academia in doing this, for instance, in the social science department, if we are talking about informality, corruption, hidden economy, all those areas are linked to development. I'm setting aside reconciliation because, as Adi said, historians here are also the problem, and not only textbook writers, but scientific historians. That is particularly damaging in the Western Balkans. Because, for instance, in the West, you have historians who are much more open about history, but usually textbooks are much more nationalistic. Let's call it like that. But here you have the whole field with very rare exceptions tied with nationalism, national interests, patriotism, and so on. But in the other part, they have to first start participating in meaningful research. Some pockets of academia are already doing this. But also, let's not forget, as probably this motivated the question, academics are also part of civil society and can be part of independent and collective action against corruption, for instance. Let's not forget that these societies have some respect to professors, to university professors. They are much more important in society, symbolically at least, compared, let's say, to the West. So there are some potential there.
Shall I continue? Yes, I guess. Okay. Can I just say something about the corruption? I think that what matters as well when talking about the fight for corruption, as someone who also looks at the public policies and public institutions across the Western Balkans, when we speak about how the politicians can fight them, is basically it's about offering an alternative to corruption. If you think about the health systems across the Western Balkans, basically a lot of corruption that happens in the health systems happens because that's the only way, or that's the quick way to get the service that you need or that you expect when you get to the hospital. So you pay a nurse to be able to visit your relatives in hospital. You pay to a nurse to bring food or something else that is better to your relatives in hospitals. You pay to a doctor to get a service that you expect. So if you're thinking from a perspective of a politician who's championing a fight against corruption, you would then think about what exactly has been done to implement policies that are gonna bring health systems to a higher level that will, prohibit or prevent, or where it would be not needed to have this corruption as a way to. So when we speak about citizens are complicit, citizens are part of it, I agree, it is true, but they do it because that's the way they can get what they need, and them and individually. So that also brings me to the point when you have governments like in North Macedonia that, for example, people from the outside perceive as very reform oriented, very progressive. Then it comes down to how do you measure their work on the anti-corruption efforts. And I think looking at the health system, understanding how often corruption was happening in the system before, for example, new government came in, and what were the measures implemented, concrete measures implemented to improve that, would be a way to also assess their fight to a certain level with the corruption. When it comes to the question on the previous generations and the new generations, I will say something that might seem blasphemic, but my point of view is that during the Yugoslav times, across the Western Balkans, there was no discussion, proper discussion about history. There was no discussion about reconciliation after the Second World War or any wars that happened before that. And in fact, what we can see in the Yugoslav history textbooks is what I've described at the beginning as a nationalistic approach to the history. So the entire discussion about history did not happen. And, we were, or our parents, my parents were taught about, heroic acts of the Second World War of the partisans. They were taught everyone else was villains. If you think about just this point that's always repeated about Yugoslavia being surrounded by troubles or problems as the first letters of the countries that surround Yugoslavia. So everything was a kind of this nationalistic approach. So I think, and sorry for making it too long, but what I think is that my generation after the war and that your generation today actually lives in a much open society than back then. You're actually able to discuss about these different narratives of history. I'm able to come to this conference and to tell you we need to look at our own history by looking at, not by being prepared not to see heroes, but also to see crimes that were committed in our names or in names of our nation. So I think that makes us much stronger and much better compared to that generation. Now, when it comes to also one point, I am 35 years old, and I belong to a generation of Bosnians and Herzegovinians that hold the gun or the weapon, that haven't been taught how to hold the gun because we don't have a military service in my country. So there is a generation, also you here in this room, there are generations and generations who have been brought up without going through the military service and similar things. So I think all that, but all that are values of our today's society, and there are many flaws. We discuss them, we can discuss them, but there are some things that I think that today are our values, such as the fact that we have the Regional Youth Cooperation Office, that we have something like this International Youth Conference that brings you together, that allows you to not just to meet each other, but also to hear about different views and different aspects. I think all of these things make us as societies stronger and make us actually more advanced in reconciliation than the previous generations were. Is that enough? Can it be reversed? It's not enough. It will never be enough. It can always be reversed. This is my last point. If I look here in Berlin, how discussions about Poland and relation of Germany with Poland are going on, you can see that reconciliation never ends. Even if you do a full circle and you have fully open borders, they're all part of Eurozone, they're all part of the Schengen zone. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Polish people are coming to Germany to work. A lot of German companies are earning by being present in Poland, and still you can have a very emotional and very heightened discussion on monuments in Berlin or monuments in Warsaw that are related to the history. So it never ends. It will always be there, but we need to be, with every generation, more stronger and more stronger. And in that respect, I think that also because of the work of initiatives like International Youth Conference, I think that this generation is at least a bit stronger than the generation for 20 years, and much stronger in some respects than those 50 years ago or 40 years ago.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adi. Maybe I can add on something, especially in terms of Yugoslavia when it comes to reconciliation. That is something that did not happen after the Second World War. Actually, it was the complete opposite, even more bloodshedding rather than talking to each other and trying to interpret what was happening during the war, but even before the war. So I think this is a lesson that our generation should learn, and that open dialogue and meeting each other and talking about different aspects of how different societies see history is very important. And I think Adi motioned that very importantly, that events such as these, where we have a chance to talk to each other and get to know each other, is something that is already being done in terms of reconciliation, starting a circle as such. Okay, do we have any other questions, comments, ideas that you would want to share? I told you, the session after lunch is always the hardest. Your blood pressure. Woo. Any questions? Oh, we have a question back there. Please, you have the microphone.
Okay, so I have a question, but first I would like to say a few things. So we all know that the corruption is a very problematic thing that rots the democratic systems, and also the political, the education, the health systems. And we all know that it is bad, but my question is, how can the young people actually report corruptions? Which mechanism they can use? Because as Mr. Misha already said, the mechanism that already exists do not fight it the right way. And in addition, how can we build new mechanisms that will be used to report and to fight the corruptions? Who will have to build them? Because the ones that already exist somehow are connected to the core of the problem.
A great question. Maybe I would also add, do you have other additional questions? No, that's the only one. Maybe I would also add to this question, is corruption only present in democracies, or do you have it, can we see it also in, I don't know, maybe if we go back in history and see it in Yugoslavia? Is there a track record, if I would use the European language, European Commission language, is there a track record of corruption not only in democracy as we know it, but also maybe in Yugoslavia?
Thank you. For sure, there was corruption in Yugoslavia, and it's not particular to democracies. I said that to reform in a democracy where power networks hold the power, it's more difficult than to have this enlightened ruler from the Enlightenment era in Scandinavia. But to go back to today, where can you report corruption? If you are a witness of a corruption, or you know of some case of corruption, First is to report it to an organization or an institution whom you trust. So, for instance, in some countries, there is an integrity within anti-corruption agencies or commissions. You can check this for your own country if you look at the assessments about the integrity of the anti-corruption agencies and bodies in, for instance, the European country report. But if you doubt, because reporting corruption can, in some cases, can reveal the identity of the person who reported corruption. That's why trust in the institution is the most important. So the least you can do is to report it to a well-known journalist. People for instance, people in Macedonia, they are more likely to report it to a political party than to a journalist, which is troublesome. Political parties use it for their own gain most of the time. But some well-known journalists will use it much better. And if you see the large disbursement of data under these huge international whistleblower cases, they have always sent evidence of corruption to reputable media outlets. So pick a journalist that you trust and report the case there. This is the least you can do. But also there are organizations within each country, civil society organizations, who work with cases. The offices of Transparency International are typically organizations where you can report cases, and they make sure that these cases are started. So they start these cases in front of the authorities, and it's usually a good place to report corruption. The local branches of Transparency International, they are, I think they are in each of the countries of the Western Balkans. So if you're not reporting it to a journalist, report it to Transparency International's local offices. What you will achieve with this? You will achieve that first, you become part of the fight against corruption. There are several ways how you fight corruption. This is one of the most important ways, that you directly participate not only by pressure, but by reporting corruption. Second, if you report it to a journalist or an organization, you make sure that at least there is this will be published. This will become known to the public or to the authorities. If you report it to Transparency International, and if they see that there are grounds for starting a process, then there will be a paper trail for a case, and this is very important. We know that we can be skeptical that this will reach a judge and a public prosecutor. We might doubt this, but if we have much more cases because of people feeling enforced and encouraged to report cases, then this is a tangible pressure for public prosecutors and judges, because they can avoid 1, 2, 10 cases, 20, 50, but they cannot avoid 100 cases. They cannot avoid a flood of reports. This is the collective action. When you have a flood of reports, and even you can build new mechanisms where, for instance, one can report corruption, or transparency, for instance, can bring a case to a public prosecutor, But then a new mechanism can be developed where you can also co-sign this. And if you have, for instance, for the same case, 100 reports, then this is much more difficult for the institution to put it in their drawers, to ignore it. And this is called federation or crowdsourcing of collective action, of pressure against the institutions.
Thank you very much, Misha. We have another questions. Nicola, once again.
Okay, then I will ask everything that I want now. No, I will be quick. Actually, once I wanted to fight against corruption, but in indirect way, knowing that my taxpayers' money will go probably percentage of it to corruption, I wanted not to declare my tax once, and I wanted to open up PayPal or something, knowing that because I had to do it my own, and I was thinking even to open up PayPal or something like that, just not to support that system. But here I am, supporting corruption with paying taxes. Enough being history expert, now I'll be fiscal expert. Misha, a question to you. I mean, we all talk about corruption, and a lot of NGOs and a lot of entities are fighting against it. But I'm starting to believe that that even they are becoming corrupted. Why? Why, you might ask? Because I'm starting to wonder, why are we so not efficient in this fight against corruption? Why this whole fight against it is so not efficient? Are they that good, or we're doing our job bad? Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Maybe I can add to the question with your experience in trying not to pay taxes. Does not paying taxes actually help anti-corruption, or do I have? Because I have a feeling that it only actually cuts down on our services. So the idea that Nicola had of not paying taxes is making it even probably worse than by just paying the taxes. Misha?
Yeah, well, you must pay your taxes. I mean, that's not avoidable. These are the only two things you must do in your life. One of the two things. Why? Because taxes, of course, as Blažan said, if we don't pay taxes, then we are decreasing the opportunities for the institutional development. But also, if you're not paying your mental process brought you to think, why should I pay taxes if the institutions are corrupt? But if you turn it up backwards, your taxes are your stake in society. Based on you being a taxpayer, you can demand things, but also it can motivate that you are part of the solution, not part of the problem. Because if you don't pay taxes, then you start losing your stake into this society. You're thinking about going outside, and that's it. And it starts another process of you basically alienating, you basically leaving society. But if you pay taxes, then you feel this ownership that institutions should work in your interest. Why is civil society not efficient? Let's call it like that. Civil society has very limited means to influence policy making. Civil society, if we talk about civil society, and then we mean by that non-governmental organizations, we represent values or represent citizens In direct or indirect way, there are different types of civil society organizations, but when there is no other leverage, what Milena and Adi were telling in terms of European perspective, which has been sort of the destination of ideological destination of many in our societies, then the citizens are the leverage. We don't have any leverage if we don't have active citizens. And we don't have that much active citizens, and civil society is mostly effective when there are active citizens. For instance, the largest impact civil society did in North Macedonia, the organized part of civil society, meaning non-governmental organizations, was during the large protests between end of 2014 and 2016. Why? Because during that period, many of the recommendations of civil society entered into programs of political parties and then entered into or became policies later when the government changes. But also, if you remember, civil society organizations were asked daily on TV to be a judge, to be an assessor of what is going on in society. We had enormous leverage there and then because there were people on the streets, there was tangible pressure, and people could see the links between civil society, civic initiatives, and some of the people within those civic initiatives being members of the organized part of civil society. Other than this, our impact can only be this incremental, small steps impact in improving policies, institutions, political processes, and we cannot expect large stories without this, what I was saying, cathartic events, big events in the history of countries, which can move things much faster. But again, the key ingredient in these cathartic events are people on the street, or in more general terms, mobilized citizens. So we cannot do much without mobilized citizens.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Misha. We have two more questions here and here in the back, and one here. Any microphones close? Ah, you already have it. Please. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Jenna from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I have a question for Misha and also Adi, if he wants to answer. When we talk about corruption, we are talking, you said the civilian society is important, NGOs are important, Transparency International are important, journalists are important, but what about justice system in that field? How much is effective and how much does good work in this category of our society when we talk about corruption? Thank you.
Sorry, what kind of citizen? I didn't hear, sorry.
Civil society, when we talk, I said civil society, and my question is, what about justice system when you talk? Do you understand me? Thank you. Is it effective enough to, let's say, to stop corruption? I know it's impossible to stop it, but how much is effective in this field?
Perfect. Thank you very much. And we have a second question back over there. Do you have the microphone, Mr. Ilya? Please.
Is it okay? Oh, yeah, cool. So I have questions for two of the speakers, for both speakers. First, for Adnan, I would like to ask your personal opinion about how much do you think that the civil society organizations and all these regional structures that we have of civil society organizations, how much are they effective in their work regarding the reconciliation process in the region? Because as we mentioned before, it is going on for generations, for a few generations now. So I guess we are not doing everything right. So I would like to ask you, what is your opinion regarding the effectiveness of the civil society? And then for Misha, I mean, usually when we talk about corruption between us and also in the mass media, mostly we are talking about big cases of corruption and even scandals. So my question is, how much do you think that the citizens, especially the young people, are aware about the different levels, but also different let's say categories of corruption that we can face, and also we can see in our everyday life, those smaller cases of corruption, how the citizens are aware about these cases, and what should we do in order to let's say educate the citizens and the young people to be able to recognize all these different types of corruption, because as we can see, we have a lot of campaigns and everything, but we are still facing this kind of corruption every day. So
Thank you very much for the questions. Maybe Adi, you can start.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me start with the judiciary, and since the question is from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Very often we do speak about rule of law and fight against corruption, etc., as something abstract and something that is not maybe understandable to the general public. I did a big study, or I did a study this summer on the rule of law in Bosnia and Herzegovina and fight against corruption, and I got a study which was 300 something pages. And I was kindly asked if I could go through it and somehow think about the ways it could be more simply explain what the study was about. And the study was very well done, but what it was missing was really the humans inside the story. And I think sometimes we do forget that it's about judges, it's about prosecutors, it's about who they are, how they're being elected, how are they being promoted, etc. And that is closely linked to the fight against corruption and to the rule of law. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, if you're a prosecutor and you would like to prosecute a complex case of high-level corruption, the system as it is, procedures inside it, actually do not encourage you to do that. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, if you take a complex case and spend, I don't know, 3 weeks or 5 weeks working on it, in the end of the year, you might get to be punished or penalized because you didn't have the number of cases. So if you're a prosecutor in a system, you're actually encouraged to have many, many small cases and not to prosecute high and complex cases. You're also not offered a resource to do that. You don't have as many assistants. You don't have many people who can help you do it. And in the end, if you have been sloppy with your cases and had it in a drawer for a couple of years and got people off the hook, as we would say, in highly complex and high-level corruption cases, you actually get promoted in the system, because it's not taken against prosecutors if they haven't taken these cases. Quite the contrary, even when the system somehow starts to work and gets to punish a prosecutor that has kept in the drawer for far too long a case of corruption, it doesn't mean that in the next year they will not become a more important prosecutor or more important judge in the system. And there are cases, there are descriptions of that. So to cut the story short, it's about the humans inside the system. It's about resources they have, which brings me then back to the politics and policies, which is important. Civil societies, organizations, citizens, and media can do as much, but we need politicians that are willing to do much more, that are willing to allocate resources, that are willing to adopt laws that will enable those in the system to actually deal with this. So I wouldn't advise you not to pay the taxes. I would advise you to push to ask these questions. How are the judges? You know, don't ask how many high-level corruption cases did we have. Ask how can we make sure that prosecutors have all they need to deal with that. On civil society organizations, I think they do a tremendous and important work. That's not just because I am part of the civil society organization, Society Life, but I think really, if you look at the Youth Initiative for Human Rights, if you look at the RICO, and if you look even at the initiative that you're part of, International Youth Conference, it's really important work. But our disappointment with the situation today should not be related to the civil society organization and their work. It should be related to the fact that the governments in our region and that the state as such has not adopted reconciliation as its own policy and has really implemented it in a way that needs to be implemented, from the education and how the schools are run and what kind of curricula they have, to what politicians in office, politicians in parliament do and about the issues related to reconciliation. So while I understand our disappointment with where we are in 2021, our anger or our disappointment cannot be directed to the civil society organizations that are basically substituting that what the state should be doing, but towards the state and politicians that need to step up and take over what they sign up to whenever they meet at the regional level or whenever they meet with the EU, and transform it into their own policies, which in both cases brings me to something I really deeply believe, and that is that we need to really look at the politicians, look at the governments and institutions as the instruments to make our lives better and make the everyday situation in our countries better. And I sometimes feel that we as citizens actually try to avoid the state, try to escape the state, and try just to, criticize and complain. So we need to push them to do more and to do exactly what is needed to be done. Thanks.
Thank you, Adi. Misha?
Yeah, I'll start with the last. How much are young people aware of corruption? Well, comparatively to other generations, they are less aware. But collectively, countries are becoming much more, people in the countries are becoming much more aware of the different categories. I often know that there is first, they are aware how much of a problem it is. In some countries, it has become the #1 problem based on public opinions. And this is a very important shift that comes in majority because of work of civil society and in media. But if we are talking about knowledge about corruption, then the largest problem that we see consistently is failure to understand conflict of interest as a form of corruption. I mean, it's a state, it's a situation right before something corrupt happens, but it is closely linked with corruption. And in surveys, we see that there is difficulty to link them as situations of conflict of interest, to link them as problems. We have done in the Institute test survey. So prior to teaching pupils in high schools how much they about corruption. So we did a test before, a test of knowledge before and after. We saw improvements in knowledge about corruption, significant. They were already relatively high, but improvements in knowledge. But education was not that successful. Training was not that successful in augmenting values that underpin allowing some sort of corrupt behavior, and that's why we think that In terms of adopting education in anti-corruption education in the formal education process, it cannot be only instruction about types and categories of corruption, but it has to be a goal for how can I distinguish obrazovание? So not instruction, but education. You know, not knowledge, but awareness about. So this should be a significant goal of the whole education, building personalities with integrity, and this is very important. About the judiciary, I agree with Adi that we are talking about people there. We are talking about problems with with the lack of qualitative assessment of their work. So basically, as Adi said, you're being evaluated based on how many cases you completed. But also we should note that there are significant problems in professional socialization with those nodes of corrupt networks in the judiciary. So I often compare them as you know, when you're keeping a cat as a pet, they quickly understand that you are a bad hunter, and they start bringing you mice and birds that they catch. This is what happened with the Prime Minister Zaev when he got Prime Minister. When he became Prime Minister, he said in an interview, the judges just came to me with a list of cases that they can do in order to further his power. So cases that were in those drawers. So they have a mind of their own, and I think it's important to know that, and to put, as Adi said, pressure on both cases, but also I agree on the processes about appointment and so on, which can be the pressures directed to the judiciary directly and indirectly in parliament as well, because many of the countries have certain involvement of formal involvement of politics into appointing judges or bodies responsible for judges.
Thank you very much, Misha. I think we have a question ready. We have a little bit, we have like 20 minutes left. So if there are any final questions that you might have, please raise a hand, or this is the last chance to get a question if you want. But please.
Yeah, I have one question. So in Bulgaria, where I'm from, we've actually discovered that the problem with corruption starts early before the parliament is actually formed, and actually the members of parliament are working in it. The corruption starts from the very process of elections and the voting process before that, even the campaigning before that. And that's why we created this platform. It is actually something that we did as an organization which is not connected to our political party. It's not connected to any political party. And you do not have to be a member of any to be involved in it. And it's a parallel counting of the votes in the campaign and of the election day. But also throughout the whole campaign, you can actually give a signal if something wrong is happening and corruption is being taking place. And right there are people who are lawyers, and they can really help you out at the moment that it arises. And this thing really is created from very young people because it works in an app and a website. And it's a whole organization now, and we'll be doing it now in November for the third time, because this will be our third elections this year for parliament. And they really show positive results, the existence of our platform. Really, the things that happen on election day, in the campaigning process, the level of corruption is insane. And the things that we actually managed to prevent, to help out. Do you have something like that in your countries? Have you considered that? And do you think that actually the process before entering parliament has to be equally monitored and taken carefully into consideration as when you are inside for corruption and dealing with that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then we have another question here.
Does this work? Okay. So I'll try to sum it up a little because I didn't have much time to think it through because I just thought of it. But I totally agree with the problems and the issues you addressed that lead to corruption. And I also agree that strengthening the rule of law is one of the main ways to solve and to lower the level of corruption. But I do think that there are some cases when law itself actually makes it easier for corruption to happen. For example, well, I'm not 100% sure for what types of crimes does this apply for, but if a crime happens and then there's a certain time of an amount of time that has to be gone after the crime has happened or the case hasn't been solved yet. And if that time passes, then the case is closed. And sometimes judges do that on purpose just so that the criminal is not punished for what they have done. So that is, for example, an example of how law actually makes it easier for corruption to interfere and to allow, criminals to get away with what they've done. And so, yeah, pretty much I think that's a really big problem, since what is supposed to actually control corruption allows it, and strengthening the law, theoretically, we've applied the law, so time has passed, so now the punishment is not done. What's the solution to that? So who checks the laws? Who's supposed to make sure that law itself is not a friend of corruption? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And since we're at the end with the last questions, maybe one thing that we didn't speak about when it comes to reconciliation and judiciary and rule of law is, can actually courts help in the process of reconciliation, in keeping upright the laws that were binding about not killing people and trying to work through the different stories and having a judicial end of the stories that were happening maybe in the 90s, something that is happening also in Kosovo, in North Macedonia, but also in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So these would be the final 3 questions that you got. Please feel free, whoever wants to start. Maybe this time, Misha.
Okay, I'll be quick because the end is very near. Okay, so regarding the laws, the laws can be, the loopholes in laws can be, can legalize corruption, or certain privileges given by laws can legalize corruption, or provide privileges to certain actors through law, and this is called legislation capture. There is one instrument which is in competence of anti-corruption agencies, but also can be implemented by civil society, but also should be part of the legislative process, not only in terms of anti-corruption agencies, but in parliament as well. And it's called anti-corruption proofing of legislation. So it is a process where people which prepare the text of the law send it to anti-corruption agencies, and anti-corruption agencies check if there are loopholes, discretionary powers, privileges given to certain actors in government or private sector, which then legalize corruption. What you were giving as example is the statute of limitations, and it's used, abused in trials, but it is a legal principle that, meaning that once you commit a crime, there is a certain amount of time that it is presumed that you have, as a person, time to rehabilitate. So you, for instance, stole from a shop. This is punished by, let's say, 1 year sentence maximum, but you have 2 years, and the law presumes that you have time to rehabilitate as a person. If you are not tried, then you cannot be tried after this period. And there are certain crimes which do not have statute of limitation, because it is presumed that you cannot rehabilitate as a person from these crimes. So yeah, this is one. This is my answer to this. In terms of parliament and elections, yes, of course. I mean, it is a cycle. Corruption that is done by authorities is also enabling, for instance, corruption at elections, because it doesn't provide the same means to different actors competing on elections. The typical form of this is clientelism. In the Western Balkans, is relatively high. For instance, it's around 9% of people being offered something in return for their vote. It is much higher to the most researched area in the world about clientelism, and that is South America, where it is around 5% of vote buying. So this gives you a perspective of how much clientelism there is in the Western Balkans. And there is one interesting thing happening when you buy votes. Is typically in democracy, politicians should be accountable to voters, because the voters invest or give their vote to a politician. When politicians buy votes, then accountability reverses, or it's perverted, because then the voter is accountable to the person who gave money or something in return for their vote. And that is why they have this means of checking whether you have voted for them. Most famously, the carousel voting, or in the region more well known as Bulgarian train. So this is how brokers check whether you have voted for them by giving you a ticket. Then you go a circle ticket. Then you go in a polling booth, and then you cast this ticket and bring back to the person who paid a clear ticket, and that is the carousel behind that kind of voting mechanism.
Thank you very much, Misha, for all the answers and all your insights. Adi?
Yes, maybe I start with the election monitoring. I was trying to find a way to explain this tax evasion or not paying the tax, and I think this election thing is the best. You can choose not to vote in elections as a way to protest against the system, or you can vote, or added to that, even better, you can be part of the civil society initiatives that do monitoring of elections. It's similar to not paying taxes. So you can not pay taxes, you can pay taxes, and then you can pay taxes and pressure politicians or governments to do with the money in a better way. I think that the election monitoring is very important. Bosnia and Herzegovina usually seen in a very negative light. Actually, election monitoring is something that is that I find positive in the past election cycles. We went from a couple of hundreds of people civil society members observing elections to last elections were, I think, around 4,000 people observing elections. And they've come up with some concrete proposals. They've really looked into observed the process, and they've come up with concrete proposals that go both at the legislative level, but also at the level of Central Election Commission, and what more they can do. And a couple of the things that they proposed actually in 2016 were implemented during the 2018 elections. And I find that really amazing result in circumstances that are in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I really hope that soon we will have reaction to many others. So I can just, I don't know if they do it in a way that Bulgaria does, if it's digitalized, etc. But I think it would be great if you could reach out to those NGOs in the region who do that, and maybe share your experience with them. On prosecutors and judges, I can say that one of the things that could be done is actually to penalize those prosecutors and those judges that are using the time that passes to help those who are sometimes known politicians, sometimes known businessmen and businesswomen, to evade of being punished for corruption. As I explained in the system in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the system is organized in a way that it does not, it's not bad for a judge or a prosecutor who, you know, postpones until the case cannot be prosecuted anymore. So that's one small thing that could actually be important inside the system to push for, and one could in public, but also inside the system push for it. And when it comes to your Blažen, your last question on the role, of course, in reconciliation in the Western Balkans, I think as well it is extremely important. We see it now in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Serbia partly, where you have this new wave of attempts to revitalize what was happened during the 1990s, to distort the facts, to insert different narratives and different distorted facts, basically, and how important it is that we had the ICTY and international tribunals that through thousands and thousands of pages, thousands and thousands of people who came to the court, they actually established many facts, a body of facts that historians can go back and that can use for actually establishing you know, a history based on an immense body of facts. And in that sense, I think also Western Balkans have been blessed that we had international tribunal, because many areas in the world today, if you think about Ukraine, if you think about Syria, if you think about Libya, are not blessed with first, they don't have peace at the moment, but also they haven't been blessed with the international tribunals that have been working out with the facts and trying to prosecute those that are that committed war crimes. So I think in that sense, as establishing facts, they were important, but also making sure that politicians in the region, at least one generation of politicians in the region, grows up with understanding that if they commit war crimes and if they commit atrocities, that they will be punished. And I think that's a great achievement that should be now trickled down to the national courts, which should, some have already started some way, but it should be speeding up and done in a much better way. On that note, I would like to thank you for inviting me. I would like to thank Misha and Milena for being part of this, for me at least, interesting and enriching panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you, Adi and Misha, and thank you very much for your insight, and thank you for holding out this long. It was a pleasure to be a moderator of you guys, and it's always nice to see you, although now it's only on a big screen, but hopefully we will see each other at some point in the near future. Thank you very much, and a big round of applause. You can disconnect now, and I will give the microphone to Nina, I think. Nina has some practical information for you.